Hey everybody, welcome back to AURAM'S Forum. Today is kind of a low-key day because, I'll be honest with you, I'm not feeling too great, but we're still going to talk about something. Luckily, this is not like a rant or something that I need to be super alive and passionate for, because as you can see on the board there, it says Netflix and then a parenthetical, but like for comics. So what that means is, and I've talked about this briefly in the past, and I think I talked about this on my Bendis episode, and maybe even on the Dan Slott episode, which wasn't really about Dan Slott, but he had talked about it a lot. Anyway, that's unimportant. It's essentially what I like to call the Netflix model of comics, but really what it is just a writer writing an entirety of their story, of like a story arc, or even maybe 2 story arcs, or however long they need to tell their story, and then drawing it all and releasing it as its own thing. Marvel and DC have done this in the past in their, I don't know if DC uses the same term, but Marvel calls them original graphic novels, which are basically just, they're not released issue by issue, they're just put out there as a big boy, and that's how they're released, and the writer gets to spend time on it, and it's just plopped down there fully. And this isn't something that I want just comics to switch to. I don't want, because manga kind of does this, where you just get like a volume every couple months instead of like 20 pages every couple, or every month, or a couple weeks, depending on the release schedule. But the reason I think this way would work, and this is just in addition to normal, that's what I was trying to say, it's in addition to normal comic release schedules where something is released bi-monthly or monthly, or I think the term that they use more is twice monthly instead of bi-monthly, because bi-monthly is confusing. Bi-monthly could be twice a month or once every 2 months. It's a mess. Those terms are just a mess. But in addition to those normal schedules, you would have certain writers and maybe even certain artists that would be on this Netflix model, where they would be able to spend pretty much as much time as they want on their book and then just release it when it's ready. Or maybe not release it when it's ready, but just have more time. And the reason I think this would benefit certain writers, and that's the key word here, is it would benefit certain writers, is because certain writers don't know how to write an issue of a comic book. They know how to write a story, and they know how to write a trade, but they don't know how to write an issue, a specific number, just random issue. And Bendis is my prime example for this. Bendis, I wish, released at a Netflix model rate, because he just cannot, and this is like the one constant criticism that I will take for Bendis throughout his career, is he does not know how to write a comic book issue. He knows how to write stories, and he knows how to foreshadow and do all this trash, but his issues just end. Go read like a current issue of Infamous Iron Man or Invincible Iron Man, or anything else that Bendis is writing right now. 90% of the time, the issue's just gonna end without much happening. There might be an end of page reveal, but when that happens, you're gonna be like, where's the rest of the comic? But the rest of the comic is just the rest of his story. He just doesn't have enough pages to tell it, because he doesn't have, the artist needs time to actually draw everything, and you know. But that's why writers like Bendis and even Jonathan Hickman to an extent, they greatly benefit from a reader sitting down and reading the whole thing in trade. You can see back here, I have all of Ultimate Spider-Man in trade, and I also have the big thick omnibus that starts off the series, but I've lended it to a friend, so he has it right now. But I've got all of that in trade, and I read Ultimate Spider-Man in trade, and it's great reading in trade. It's a Bendis book, for those that don't know. It's an incredible book reading in trade, but when you dissect it issue by issue, not a lot happens issue by issue. I think the only story arc that comes to mind in Ultimate Spider-Man specifically, where Bendis was like actually writing good issue-by-issue stories, was the Ultimate Clone Saga. Because in the Ultimate Clone Saga, shit hit the fan every issue. So you just had things happening, and that kept you entertained. Whereas, and this goes hand in hand with another Bendis criticism / just how Bendis writes stories, is his decompression storytelling, where Bendis takes in between story arcs, or just even in the middle of a story arc, he'll take an entire issue just to decompress, to have something crazy happen, and then just let every character mellow for a bit. Bendis used this in Ultimate Spider-Man a lot as just one-shots that focused on relationships. There were a lot of one-shots that focused on Peter and MJ's relationship, or just Peter and whoever else he was into at the time's relationship. And that was fine, especially fine reading in trade, but when those decompression storyline issues happen in the middle of a story arc, you get frustrated because you feel like you've wasted $3 on an issue, and then you have to wait another month to get the actual continuation of the storyline. But with this Netflix model, Bendis would be able to use however many decompression storyline issues he wants to, and just drop it all at once. So people are judging not issue by issue, but story arc by story arc. And the reason I mentioned Hickman earlier is because I feel like he fell prey a little bit to this during his New Avengers run. I read the entirety of both of those runs in trade, minus the last couple issues of them, because I caught up, but I read pretty much all of that in trade, and it was fantastic, and it's still I think it's a beautiful series. And that leads into Secret Wars, but a lot of people I heard were kind of frustrated with it when it was coming out, because just not a lot happened issue by issue. Things just were kind of slowly moving along and building up into Secret Wars and everything else that was going on. But again, with this Netflix model of comics, Hickman could have just released, like, maybe not the entirety of the Incursion saga in New Avengers, but he could have released, like, just story arc by story arc. There's like 4 or 5 volumes of New Avengers that I read by trade, but people at the time of their release were reading issue by issue. I'm sure that was frustrating for some people, because it just takes a while to build up a story. And there are writers who thrive in the issue by issue storytelling model, or release model, and those are people like Tom King is like a master of all of it. Like, you read a Tom King story issue by issue, and it's great. Like, every issue blows you away in some capacity, and it's just a really solid comic because that man knows how to write comic books. But then on the flip side, you can also read his stories in trade format, and then you see things that you didn't see while you're reading issue by issue, like foreshadowing and all this stuff, because your brain, like, especially when DC doesn't do the recaps that Marvel does at the beginning of each comic, your brain just kind of forgets stuff. And the reason I mentioned DC over Marvel right now is because Tom King is currently writing Batman, so that's what I'm thinking of. And Tom King also does use that thing that Bendis uses, where he will decompress between story arcs. Like, right after The Button, which was the huge continuity immersed crossover between Batman and the Flash, he just had just a one-shot in between. I think it was Batman 23, where it was just a nice one-shot storyline that involved Batman and Swamp Thing, and that allowed you to decompress in between that and the next story arc, which I think it wasn't even the next story arc happened right after. I think there was another one-shot that focused on Batman and Catwoman's relationship, and then the next story arc started. So Tom King felt that you should decompress a little bit, and that's what he did, and it worked really well. So what I'm trying to say here is, I think Tom King is a writer who wouldn't need the Netflix model if it was a thing. He can thrive without it, and that's totally fine. I'm not saying that every writer needs to conform to this, because that's not true at all. Like, Tom King works both ways, and I know I'm harping a lot on Tom King here, but A, that's because he's probably my favorite writer, and B, he's just on my mind right now. No, I can't think of... It's hard to think of a lot of writers who really succeed in the issue-by-issue storytelling, because most of the time you either have a writer that really thrives in it, like Tom King, or a writer that's really pour at it like Bendis, and then everyone else is in the middle ground where they just sometimes are happening, or there are points where you're just reading their comic and you're like, things are happening in front of me, but nothing is really interesting. But then, like, maybe you go back like a year later and read it just straight through, and your mind is blown. You got a whole new perspective on it. And that's really kind of what Bendis's writing does, where, like, you go back, and I'm sure if you went back and read his Invincible Iron Man that he just did, it's probably way better to read in trade, because things just kind of happen. And it's still good. Like, you still get good moments in his books, but Bendis's books are just much better to read in trade, or just as a full story arc. And then, like, there's another argument that comes into this, which is, why don't you just trade weight certain books? And that's fair, that's very valid, and for those that don't know what that means, trade weighting is essentially just, you wait for a story arc to end, it's collected in trade about a month later, and then you just go buy it as it's trade, and you don't read it as it's coming out. But that's a problem for someone like me who, like, disregarding that I have to, for work and for being, like, a comic book, like a, how do I say this without sounding like a jerk? As someone who puts the image out there that I read a lot of comic books, and enough so that I feel like I have the authority to make a YouTube channel about them, which I don't feel like I have the authority to make a YouTube channel about them. I just do, because I can. But as someone who has a platform, I don't want to speak about books if I don't know what's going on in them currently. And also, like, the show with reviews is a great example. I don't like reviewing comics that are over a week old on the show with reviews unless I really have something to say about them. And that's just because people have lost interest at that point. So basically what I'm trying to say is, regardless of, take the channel out of the equation of me being current and having to be current. There's also just my brain, and I'm sure there's lots of other people who are like this, where they need to know what's going on constantly. They need to be current. And this is like a problem that a lot of new readers come into. That's why a lot of new readers don't become new readers, is because they see that big number, that 600, or they see that this character's been around for 75 years, and they get very overwhelmed because they're like, well, I gotta get current, I gotta read everything, and that's clearly not true. But I mean, I'm evidence of that. I started reading comics 3 years ago, and I started with, like, Marvel Now, so it's very clearly not true. But people do struggle with that, and I struggle with that as well, where, and it's hard for me to drop a book, because I've gotten better about it, but there was a time where I wanted to read everything, unless I really just wasn't interested in a character, or a book was just that bad, because I wanted to know what was going on, just in the context of these universes 24/7. So, what I'm trying to say is that trade waiting for me, and I feel like for a lot of people, is not an option. It's just not. Like, I can trade wait certain books, but and I decided a little while ago that I was gonna trade weight some books, but I just can't, especially now that there's also, like, the money issue. People trade weight because buying comics week to week is monetarily not viable for them, but going to the store and buying, like, a $10 to $20 trade every couple months is more viable, and that's fine as well. That's another valid argument, but that argument kind of went away from me because I just because of work, I get all my comics for free, so, and I buy older comics in trade, like those Ultimate Spider-Man books, but it's again, that's just not, personally for me, I'm just, take anything from that whole huge section of this video, trade waiting doesn't work for me, and I'm sure it doesn't work for lots of other people, who are just obsessed with being immersed in the universes and being continuity driven. And there's also the avoidance of spoilers. Like, personally, I hate being spoiled about things, and I know a lot of people hate being spoiled about things, so not being current makes me very nervous about going on the internet and seeing spoilers, because you go on like a thing and you see Captain America's Hydra. That was actually spoiled for me, that Hydra reveal. And that's abnormal because that was like huge and that blew up and the media took a hold of it. This is like a good thing about comic books is you can wait like months and you won't be spoiled about a certain thing that happened in Invincible Iron Man #7 or something. But when the media grabs something, it does go crazy. And that was the specific thing for the Hydra reveal, is I just saw like a Twitter headline about it, and I hadn't read comics yet that day, so that was spoiled for me. What I'm trying to say, to wrap this all back up into the Netflix thing, is a Netflix model for comics would satiate writers who don't thrive in the comic book, the traditional comic book release schedule of issue by issue, and it would also help people like me who don't want to trade wait because of a plethora of reasons, whether it be spoilers, wanting to stay current, having to stay current, stuff like that. And it also just kind of helps to kind of diversify the way that comics are put out, because I do think a large problem with why certain new readers don't become new readers is because it's expensive. And DC has taken huge strides to help this, where with DC Rebirth, every comic is $2.99 across the board. And that's amazing. That's incredible. And Marvel is very pig-headed about it. They don't care. They're talked about this in the Marvel Legacy episode, how Marvel Legacy #1 is $6 and it's a 60-page one-shot, where DC Rebirth #1 was an 80-page one-shot and it was $3. So Marvel's a little bit, we don't want to do that. But you could still sell your premium comics. Like, you could sell, if Marvel, for example, if Marvel did the DC thing and they made all their comics $3, $2.99, and introduced this Netflix model and put specific writers on it and had maybe one original graphic novel or Netflix model book come out every couple months, sell it for $20, people will buy it. Especially if you have like star creators on it and you advertise it as like a whole story in this one book, and just they're doing it with the original graphic novels, but the original graphic novels come out like once every couple of years, which is not good. And I don't even know why they do it. It doesn't make any sense to me. Because the last one that I read was Rage of Ultron, which was like 2015, which was like 2 years ago, and it was fine, nothing special about it, but I didn't understand why it came out that way as an original graphic novel. I don't understand why those exist, because they're just an anomaly when they come out. But if you introduce this Netflix model, it would make more sense, because a person would just tell their story issue by issue. And another thing that made me very confused about Rage of Ultron is it had very clear issue breaks in it. Like, there weren't like issue 1, issue 2, issue 3, but you could tell, as if you're like an avid comic book reader and you're used to seeing those issue breaks at the end of comics, there were like full page reveals after like a couple pages, and that book just felt like a story arc that would have been released issue by issue, but for some reason they decided to release it as an original graphic novel. So, and I'm sure that would be like, writers would have to get used to it if they're not used to writing for trade, where it would be this weird kind of way where they're still writing issue by issue and they're not utilizing the new release medium that they have, I guess. It would just be a transition period that we would have to get through, but that's why you would only use specific writers on it. So that's about it. I don't really know what else to say on this. This one was kind of a more rambly one. They're all rambly, but I just wanted to present an idea. This is kind of what AURAM'S Forum was supposed to be, but it turned into me yelling at the wall forever. But that's fine. So anyway, that's what I think about Netflix model. What do you think about Feckflick model? Let's talk about that in the comments or on Twitter. Here's the Twitters. We got mine. We got Andrew and Julie's. They're one amorphous being, the editors. That's them. Anyway, thanks for watching. we have fun times on this forum of mine. I'm really sorry that you had to watch this. Bye now.